What's good, YouTube? Today we're going to go over 5 specs that are going to be safe bets for Mythic Plus. If this video helps you, please feel free to subscribe to your boy and also drop a like down below. But without further ado, let's get on with the classes. So let's kick things off with a class that I'm sure nobody is surprised about. It is the Havoc Demon Hunter. This spec has been outrageous as of recent on the beta, probably cementing itself as the best overall DPS out of any of the other specs. It has the highest AoE DPS in most situations and very good single target damage as well for those bosses and tyrannical weeks. This is thanks to having its cooldowns up pretty much every pool. You have short cooldowns like Essence Break. You have I-Beam, obviously every pool granting you meta, which is going to increase your haste and empower your abilities. And then you also have Immolation Aura doing most of your damage after it gets buffed up by a few talents, and over the course of the key, Immolation Aura will be one of your top damaging abilities, if not the top. It really is putting out some crazy numbers now, and this allows you to perform in pretty much any situation, and the tank or group doesn't actually have to pull around any of your cooldowns because they are always up. I was a bit skeptical putting Havoc in this list because I think if anything's going to be the target of nerfs, it would be this spec. However, I think even if it does get nerfed, obviously permitting that it doesn't get absolutely gutted, I think this spec will still be very good and a safe bet for Mythic Plus. This spec has great defensive capabilities as well, through passive damage reductions that the Demon Hunter class in general will have, from talents like Will of the Illidari and also Illidari Knowledge, increasing your max health and also reducing magic damage that you actually take. You have more passives like Soul Rending, increasing your leech, and further increasing leech while you're in Metamorphosis, and then combining these passives with abilities like Blur, a very strong defensive cooldown on a short cooldown as well, and also Darkness that doesn't only help the Demon Hunter itself but also your whole group. It makes Havoc virtually unkillable if played well. Havoc is also quite slept on for utility as well. It has a single target stun in Fell Eruption. It's got AoE stuns through Chaos Nova and obviously your meta ability. When you pop that, which I know is obviously every 4 minutes, you do get that AoE stun effect as well. You have Sigil of Misery as well for another AoE stop, which you can talent into, actually making mobs take more damage from you after that effect ends, just further incentivizing you to actually use that ability. And then also you obviously have Imprison as well, which is one of the few abilities in the game, just allowing you to skip unnecessary mobs if they are inefficient count. You obviously have Chaos Brand as well, which is going to be great for any casters in your group, which we will probably end up taking one at least, but unfortunately for the Havoc Demon Hunter, it is looking like a bit of a melee meta, so I don't know how useful this piece of utility will actually be, but we'll have to see how the meta plays out. The Havoc Demon Hunter really has no downsides to any of its kit, especially in a Mythic Plus scenario. It has some of the best DPS in the game, great defensives, and also some pretty underrated utility as well. Next, we have the Outlaw Rogue. Again, no shock, I'm sure. Rogue, but Outlaw Rogue in specific, is like the perfect class for Mythic Plus. It always has been, and it always will be, as long as nothing changes too much. Outlaw Rogues in specific have great damage across the board. This is obviously one of the few classes that are actually AoE capped. It has gotten a little bit better for the Outlaw Rogue now, being able to hit 8 mobs instead of 5 as it was previously. However, in massive pools, it will fall behind a little bit, but being the rogue class already, you could just swap out to sub rogue if you needed to for those dungeons. There's not too many dungeons that are actually going to allow this to be the case. However, dungeons like Algathar's Academy, you could see benefit to swapping out to the Subtlety Rogue to take advantage of those mass AoE pools that are pretty frequent throughout the dungeon. That being said though, Outlaw is very competitive in AoE still. There's not many scenarios where you will be mass AoE pulling, and the single target damage coupled with the very competitive damage you can pull in up to 10 mobs just makes Outlaw a very solid spec from a damage perspective. Also being one of the very few specs in the game where their single target damage translates directly to their AoE damage makes them unique, and this is a very desired damage profile for Mythic Plus because you can dump that single target prio damage into your prio mob that needs to die faster while also only having to press pretty much one button to make that damage also AoE through Blade Flurry. Rogue in general also has pretty much unmatched utility through abilities like Shroud, where you can skip packs and pretty much play the dungeon how you want, which allows for much more flexibility in your routes and being able to knock that much more time off the timer. You have more utility in the way of your poisons. You have an incredibly strong choice node between Atrophic Poison and also Numbing Poison, which is just going to lock down mobs for your group, and over the course of the key make your group take a lot less damage from mobs that are victim to these poisons. You obviously have Sap as well to skip mobs if your Shroud is down for whatever reason. You have unlimited stops through stuns, like Cheap Shot and Kidney Shot, and also abilities like Blind if you're ever lacking the stuns. And as a rogue, you are pretty much unkillable through abilities like Feint, for AoE incoming damage that you know you're about to take. You obviously have Cloak of Shadows and Evasion, and also a cheat death for wherever you fail to press either your defensive abilities or something just hits that hard that it one-shots you. You will actually be able to survive these one-shot mechanics where most other classes wouldn't be able to. Rogue is always a safe choice for Mythic Plus. It is always one of the top performers in this type of content, and it doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon. Next, we have the first range spec on this list. Range specs seem few and far between for safe choices for this first season at least of Dragonflight. However, that being said, it is nice to bring a ranged, especially with a new Thundering affix going into season 1. Obviously, you do want to chill on the amount of melee that you bring because you're going to be stacked up on top of each other and probably lose that 30% damage increase pretty much instantly, unless you're a very coordinated group. Demonology Warlock has some great damage. Unfortunately, it's not quite as good as the previous specs mentioned. However, it definitely still holds its own, especially in an AoE scenario where mobs are grouped up. A massive piece of utility that the Warlock actually brings is obviously a battle res, which for Mythic Plus content, the more the merrier, honestly. And the Warlock in general does bring some great utility too. Obviously, you're bringing health stones for your group, which you can replenish as the runs go on to help survive those dangerous mechanics or dangerous fights. I know there's definitely some coming up in Dragonflight. You have summons for whatever reason. If you skip and then one of your party dies, you can summon them back without them having to waste an invis pot or something of the likes. You can also use this for niche scenarios where you might want to jump out and swap specs and then get your group to summon you back, or summon your friend that has just swapped specs themselves. You also have gateways, which we'll need to work this one out, but they have been used for skips before, so we'll have to see if there's any scenarios where this actually is going to be useful. And also pre-placing them in the right places on different fights is going to help your group massively. We see this in Raid all the time, and it can definitely be translated to Mythic Plus. You also then have an AoE stun through Shadow Fury, and you can bolster the strength of this by reducing its cooldown, or instead taking a 70% AoE slow in a cone in front of you to further bolster your utility. Warlocks have some ridiculous survivability as well. If you thought it was good before, it is insane now. Through passives like Soul Leech and Demon Skin, just stacking up those shields over the course of a dungeon really is some ridiculous healing and mitigation. It does actually take quite a considerable amount of damage to actually break these shields. And if any abilities do manage to do that, you then have Dark Pact, which you can talent into being a 45-second cooldown. You have Unending Resolve as well, which is a very strong defensive. It is truly impressive if you do manage to die on a Warlock in general. And that is actually why I'm going to rate it as one of the safer classes to pick for Mythic Plus, as survivability seems to be a lot more valuable coming into Dragonflight. Speaking of survivability, a little wildcard that I want to throw into this list is actually the Frost Mage. In Dragonflight, there seems to be a lot of unavoidable damage and also massive damage at that. So survivability really is going to be king for this expansion, it seems. Frost Mage is ridiculously tanky, as I'm sure we all know, through double ice blocks with that cold snap reset. You've also got your ice barriers, which you can talent into heals from that now. You can get absorb shields from blinks. You have alter time, mirror images as well for a 20% damage reduction, and now also all the mage specs have access to greater invisibility as well. They really are unkillable, which for higher keys is definitely a massive pro. They may not have the greatest damage out of all the specs, however they can pull their own weight, especially in an AoE scenario, but their true selling point is through their survivability but also their utility as well. They obviously have a consistent 60% slow on all the mobs that they're fighting, which is very strong, not even just for a survivability perspective for the tanks. It also allows specs to deal more damage because the mobs are grouped up in the same place for longer. So any ground targeted ability is going to end up doing more damage, for example, Flame Patch in previous seasons, and also the likes of Rain of Fire. But like I said, this also does allow tanks to pretty much kite whenever they want. Frost Mage now also has access to Dragon's Breath, which is a very strong AoE disorient to stop any deadly casts, and Frost Mage is also known for its great funnel ability. Just being able to dump those ice lancers into prior mobs really is a great damage profile for any class. I think Mage in general is always a pretty safe pick for Mythic Plus, just from their overall kit. Obviously they are actually one of the tankiest specs in the game, whether you're playing Frost or Fire. We won't talk too much about Arcane, bless them, but the fact that they can't die, coupled with the fact that they have some decent damage, and if they were to receive any buffs, they would almost definitely have a spot in the meta, I think deserves them a place on this list. Another very tanky spec going into Dragonflight is the Windwalker Monk. This spec is incredibly tanky if played well. I say that because it doesn't have many passive DRs, but it has a plethora of active defensive abilities through Touch of Karma, Fortifying Brew, Dampen Harm, and Diffuse Magic. If you press these abilities at the right time, you're always going to have an answer to every single scenario, and this is going to be huge for surviving those higher keys. Obviously, we know the Windwalker Monk has some very high damage as well, definitely amongst probably the top 5 DPS in terms of raw damage output. They're not quite as strong as Havoc in the damage department, however they have amazing consistently high AoE burst, which is a very nice damage profile for Mythic Plus. And also, surprisingly for the Windwalker, they now have competitive single target damage as well. Their utility is also incredible, with abilities like Leg Sweep on a very short cooldown. The AoE stun never does go amiss. But up there with their amazing utility is obviously the very unique Ring of Peace ability, allowing your whole group to kite, or specifically your tank, and get away from mobs to reset his defensive cooldowns. Ring of Peace is a very strong defensive piece of utility that is also on a short cooldown as well, so make sure to make the most out of this ability. With what's seeming to be a melee meta as well, anyone within 10 yards of the Windwalker will receive a 4% avoidance buff through the passive ability Generous Pour, and also an 8% increase to healing taken from all sources through the passive Close to Heart if they decide to spec into this. Some very strong utility that the Windwalker brings, coupled with its amazing damage profile and also a very strong defensive kit. The Windwalker is definitely a safe pick for Mythic Plus going into the first season of Dragonflight. So these are my 5 safe picks in terms of DPS specs for Mythic Plus. I try to pick these specs based off their survivability but also their utility, just in case we do see any damage tuning as we go into these first weeks of Dragonflight. Let me know if you have any other picks for safe classes or specs for Mythic Plus. I'm sure there's definitely a few more to be listed. If you like the video, and also subscribe to your boy for daily Dragonflight content. And until next time, catch you later.